Imagine trying to explore, say, a huge national park, maybe Yellowstone. But there's a catch. You can only walk about 1,000 feet from your little base camp before you absolutely have to turn back.
Right. And you can see these incredible mountains, these geysers, these canyons in the distance.
Exactly. You know, the real secrets, the amazing views, they're just over that ridge, maybe down in that valley, but you can't reach them.
Well, that was pretty much the reality for the first few Apollo landings, Apollo 11, 12, 14. Incredible achievements, obviously, but the exploration, strictly pedestrian.
Limited by how far you could walk in those bulky suits and still get back safely.
And then came July 1971, Apollo 15.
This is where everything changes.
Completely. This mission didn't just tweak the formula. It threw out the old playbook. It wasn't just about bringing better scientific instruments, though they did that too. It was about bringing mobility. It was about, well, driving on the moon.
The first car on another world. It sounds almost like science fiction, even now.
It really does, and it marks this huge pivot point for NASA. They moved decisively away from just proving they could land and operate on the moon.
To actually exploring it in depth.
Yeah.
Like a real scientific expedition.
Exactly. Committing to serious, robust, deep scientific exploration. That was the defining leap of Apollo 15.
Okay, so let's dive into this, because Apollo 15, landing number 4, it was clearly much more than just another flag planting. It signals this big strategic shift for the whole Apollo program, right?
Absolutely. If you look at the overall goals NASA set out, things like establishing the technology, achieving scientific preeminence, developing the human capability to actually work up there.
Apollo 15 was designed to push all those boundaries way further than before.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that Apollo 15 was the very first of what NASA called the J missions.
J missions. Okay, what did that J signify?
Well, the earlier landings, like 12 and 14, they were primarily H missions. Think engineering tests, precision landings, shorter stays. The J designation, it meant a massive step up in scientific ambition. We're talking long-duration stays, complex geological targets, and significantly upgraded hardware.
So more time on the surface, more science packed in. How much longer are we talking?
Significantly longer. They planned for nearly 3 full days on the lunar surface. That's almost 75 hours.
Wow, compared to what? Around 30 hours or so for the H missions?
Yeah, roughly. So more than double the surface time. And that, of course, had huge implications. It meant needing much better life support systems, way more battery power in the lunar module.
And critically, this new hardware specifically designed for getting around, for geological fieldwork.
The rover. But also, the lunar module itself was beefed up to carry more consumables, support the rover, and stay functional for that extended period. It was a serious upgrade across the board, all aimed at turning the astronauts into, essentially, full-time field scientists on the moon.
And if you're going to spend that much time doing science, you need to pick your landing spot very carefully. Wow. This wasn't just about finding a flat, safe place anymore.
No, not at all. They chose a site that was, frankly, spectacular, but also incredibly ambitious from a geological standpoint. The Hadley Apennine region.
Hadley Rill and the Apennine Mountains. Just looking at the photos, it's breathtaking.
It really is, and geologically fascinating. The site sits right next to Hadley Rill, which is this enormous winding channel, almost like a dried-up riverbed or maybe a collapsed lava tube, over 1,000 feet deep in places.
A massive canyon.
And it's at the foot of the Apennine Mountains, which are just gigantic. Some peaks rise higher than anything in the Rockies.
So why there? What were scientists hoping to find?
Complexity and age. They believe this area offered access to really ancient lunar materials, maybe stuff ejected from deep within the moon by massive impacts that formed nearby basins like Imbrium. They hoped to find rocks representing the moon's original crust.
The primordial stuff.
Exactly. And they wanted to investigate the rill itself. Was it volcanic? How did it form? This site promised answers to fundamental questions about the moon's history, but
you couldn't explore a place like that just by walking. The scale's too big.
Precisely. The mountains, the rill, the different geological units, they were miles apart. This landing site demanded long-range mobility. It absolutely required the lunar roving vehicle.
Which leads us to the crew. You need the right people for a mission this complex, this focused on geology. Who got the keys to the first moon buggy?
The crew selection really reflected that scientific priority. The commander was David R. Scott. He was a veteran, flew on Gemini 8 and Apollo 9. Very experienced.
Okay.
The lunar module pilot, the one who'd be exploring the surface with Scott, was James B. Irwin. And orbiting above in the command module was Alfred Worden.
And you mentioned they had serious geology training.
Oh, yeah. Arguably the most extensive geology training of any crew up to that point. If you look through the historical documents, the records of their geology training, their field exercises, they spent months, literally months, learning from top geologists.
Doing traverses here on Earth, practicing sample collection.
Practicing identifying different rock types, understanding geological formations, learning how to describe what they were seeing in precise scientific language for the teams back in Houston. They weren't just test pilots anymore. They were being trained as genuine field geologists. So, the mission plan: high science, spectacular location, geologist crew, and the enabling piece of technology, the absolute star of this new J mission era, the Lunar Roving Vehicle, the LRV. The LRV. It wasn't just a nice to have, it was fundamental. Apollo 15 was the first time humans drove a vehicle on the moon, and that single fact completely changed the game.
It expanded their reach. How much are we talking? From maybe a few hundred yards?
2 miles. Suddenly, they weren't tethered quite so tightly to the lunar module, the LM Falcon. Before the LRV, everything was dictated by the walk-back limit.
Meaning how far you could walk and still get back to the LM if something went wrong with your suit.
Exactly, your oxygen supply, basically. With the LRV, you had, in effect, a mobile base. It had its own navigation, its own communication systems. It carried tools, carried samples.
It was like a little pickup truck for the moon.
Kind of, yeah. And this meant a huge procedural shift. They moved from these short, almost tentative little walks near the lander to planning complex, multi-hour, long-distance geological traverses, following detailed timelines using surface checklists. They could target a specific crater miles away or a slope on a mountain.
Knowing they could actually get there, do the work, and get back.
It fundamentally changed the nature of surface exploration.
Okay, but the logistics of this, I mean, how do you pack a car, even a small one, onto a lunar lander? It seems almost absurd.
It was an incredible piece of engineering, truly ingenious. There's great documentation on this, like the old Boeing brochures for the LRV.
Boeing built it?
Yes, Boeing led the effort. The vehicle itself was mostly lightweight aluminum alloy. On Earth, it weighed about 460 pounds.
Okay, not insignificant.
But on the moon, with 1/6 gravity, only about 77 pounds, manageable. But the trick was getting it there, folded up.
Right, the deployment. I've seen diagrams, almost like origami. How did that work?
It was stowed, folded up like a transformer, in a bay on the side of the LM's descent stage. Bay 1 specifically. To get it out, one of the astronauts, usually the commander, Scott in this case, pulled a series of lanyards.
Just pulls a cord.
Well, several cords in sequence. This initiated an automated deployment using springs, cables, hinges, gravity helped, even lunar gravity. The whole thing unfolded itself, swung outwards, the chassis locked, the wheels pivoted down and locked.
Wow. All automatically.
Mostly. The crew then did the final steps using straps and pulleys to lower it the last few feet to the surface. But the initial complex unfolding, that had to work perfectly.
And if it didn't?
If it jammed, if it failed, the entire scientific mission, the J mission concept for Apollo 15, would have been severely compromised. They would have been back to walking distance. The pressure for that deployment to succeed was immense.
Total reliance on that one piece of technology. So, assuming it deploys successfully, which it did, what was it actually like to drive? What made it work on the moon?
Well, first off, it was all electric, battery-powered, 2 non-rechargeable silver, zinc, potassium hydroxide batteries.
Okay, and propulsion.
4 separate drive motors, 1 in each wheel hub. This gave it redundancy. If one motor failed, they could keep going. It also provided excellent traction. And the wheels themselves were fascinating.
Not rubber tires, right?
No, couldn't use inflatable tires in a vacuum and with those temperature extremes. They were made of a woven mesh of zinc-coated steel piano wire.
Piano wire. Seriously.
Yep. Flexible, strong. And then they riveted titanium chevrons onto the mesh surface, like treads, to bite into the lunar soil, the regolith.
That's brilliant. That wire mesh design just screams space vehicle.
Yeah.
But what about dust? We always hear about lunar dust being a nightmare.
It was a huge problem. Fine, abrasive, gets into everything. The LRV had fenders, sort of like minimalist mud guards, above each wheel to try and deflect the worst of it.
Did it work?
Partially. The crew reported dust still got kicked up quite high, coating everything. Visibility could be an issue. But the fenders definitely helped prevent catastrophic amounts from getting into the mechanisms.
And driving. Was it fast? Smooth?
Not particularly fast. Top speed was maybe 8 miles per hour, though they apparently pushed it a bit faster downhill once. The ride was described as bouncy. Scott famously called it a bucking bronco sometimes. The suspension had to handle rocks and small craters.
In navigation. How did they know where they were going and how to get back?
Crucial point. Getting lost was not an option. It had a pretty sophisticated navigation system for the time. Gyroscopes, odometers on the wheels. It continuously calculated their direction and distance back to the LM Falcon. There was a display on the console showing heading range, bearings.
So they always had that arrow pointing home.
Absolutely essential for safety, especially when driving miles away over terrain where the LM was hidden behind hills or ridges. The LRV wasn't just transport, it was their lifeline and navigation hub. Incredible piece of kit. Okay, let's get into part 2. The Grand Tour. They had this amazing vehicle. How far did Scott and Irwin actually go? Over their 3 moonwalks, or EVAs, extravehicular activities, they conducted 3 major geological traverses. Added all together, they drove just over 17 miles, about 28 kilometers.
17 miles, compared to maybe a mile total walking distance on previous missions.
Exactly. It was a quantum leap in range. More ground covered on this one mission than all the previous Apollo landings combined. Transformative doesn't even begin to cover it.
Well, what were they seeing out there? We have the transcripts, right? The descriptions back to Houston.
We do, in the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. And it's fantastic listening. You hear them driving along the edge of Hadley Rill, that massive canyon, describing the layers in its walls. They drove up the flank of the Apennine Mountains, looking at huge boulders.
Must have been awe-inspiring.
They described the scale, the silence, the stark beauty. But they were also working constantly, using geological hammers, scoops, core tubes, taking hundreds of photos, collecting samples, digging trenches to examine the soil layers. The voice transcripts are full of detailed geological descriptions being relayed back to mission control.
You can really hear them operating as field scientists, using the LRV as their mobile platform.
That's exactly what it was. They'd drive to a location identified from orbital photos, hop off, do their sampling and observations, load up the rover, and drive to the next spot. The sheer volume of work they accomplished is laid out in things like the sample catalogs and the preliminary science reports. The LRV really enabled a whole new kind of lunar science. Which brings us neatly into part 3, major discoveries. What was the big scientific prize they were hunting for at Hadley Apennine? The Holy Grail, really, was a piece of the moon's original primordial crust. A rock dating back to the very formation of the moon, probably over 4, maybe 4.5 billion years ago.
And how would they recognize such a thing?
Scientists back on Earth had predicted what it might look like, based on theories of how the moon formed. They were looking for a specific type of rock called a northocite. It's relatively light in color and composed mainly of a mineral called plagioclase feldspar.
Okay, so they had a target rock type in mind. Did they find it?
They did. On the second traverse, EVA-2, they drove up the slope of a mountain called Hadley Delta. At a planned stop, Station 7, near a crater called Spur Crater, Jim Irwin spotted it.
He just saw it lying there.
Pretty much. He called out something like, "Oh man," or "Guess what we just found?" Scott came over. They described it this whitish rock, crystalline. They knew, or at least strongly suspected, they had found what they came for.
And this became the famous Genesis rock.
That's the one. Sample 15415, technically.
Why was it so important scientifically? What did it confirm?
It was a nearly pure piece of anorthosite. Finding it provided incredibly strong evidence for the lunar magma ocean hypothesis.
The idea that the early moon was covered in molten rock?
Exactly. The theory was that as this massive ocean of molten rock cooled, lighter minerals like the feldspar that makes up anorthosite crystallized and floated to the top, forming the moon's initial crust. Finding the Genesis rock, which analysis later dated to around 4 billion years old, was a stunning confirmation of that theory. It was like finding a piece of the moon's birth certificate.
A direct sample of the moon's oldest crust, made possible entirely because the rover could get them up that mountain slope.
Without the LRV, they never would have reached Spur Crater, never would have found it.
An amazing discovery. But the science wasn't only happening on the surface, was it? While Scott and Irwin were driving around, Alfred Worden was orbiting above in the command module Endeavour.
That's right, and Worden's role was absolutely critical for the mission's scientific success. He wasn't just driving the bus.
He was doing science, too, from orbit.
A huge amount of science. While Scott and Irwin were getting the ground truth, the detailed samples from specific spots, Worden was conducting large-scale orbital science, mapping, remote sensing, providing the bigger picture context.
How? What was different about the Command and Service Module, the CSM, on this mission?
The big difference was the addition of the Scientific Instrument Module Bay, the SIM Bay, in the service module.
Okay, what was in the SIM Bay?
It was packed. seriously packed with advanced instruments. There was a huge 24-inch panoramic camera taking incredibly detailed photos of the surface. There was a mapping camera system for creating precise topographical maps.
So generating the data for future landing site selection, things like that.
Absolutely. Plus, there was a laser altimeter bouncing beams off the surface to measure altitude with unprecedented accuracy, and spectrometers, a gamma-ray spectrometer, an X-ray spectrometer.
Those two.
They measured the chemical composition of the lunar surface from orbit. As Worden flew over different regions, these instruments could detect variations in elements like aluminum, magnesium, silicon, even trace amounts of radioactive elements. He was essentially mapping the moon's chemistry. Wow. So you have this dual approach. Scott and Irwin finding the Genesis rock, one specific crucial detail, and Worden orbiting above, painting the broad canvas, mapping the topography and the chemistry over vast areas. The two data sets complemented each other perfectly.
You needed both. The ground samples needed the orbital context, and the orbital data needed the ground samples for calibration and verification.
Precisely. Worden's work, documented extensively in the Apollo Flight Journal, was just as important as the surface exploration for achieving that goal of scientific preeminence. He was running a one-man orbital science laboratory. Incredible. Okay, let's shift gears slightly into part 4, iconic moments. Beyond the hardcore science, Apollo 15 gave us some truly memorable images and events. One famous physics demonstration comes to mind. Ah, yes, the hammer and feather, a classic.
Tell us about that. It happened right at the end of the last moonwalk.
That's right, EVA-3. Commander Dave Scott decided to perform a little experiment for the television audience back on Earth. He wanted to demonstrate a principle famously attributed to Galileo.
Which is?
That in the absence of air resistance in a vacuum, objects will fall at the same rate regardless of their mass.
The old thought experiment about dropping a cannonball and a feather from the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Exactly. Except Scott could actually do it for real on the moon, where there's essentially no atmosphere, so he stood there in front of the TV camera.
Which is mounted on the rover.
Yes. And he held out a geological hammer in one hand, probably weighed a couple of pounds, and a falcon feather in the other. The feather was a tribute to the lunar module Falcon.
Let's touch.
He held them up, said a few words about Galileo, and then just let them go simultaneously. And they hit the lunar dust at the exact same instant. Plop. Perfectly together.
Wow. Simple, elegant, visual proof of a fundamental law of physics.
It was brilliant science communication, using the unique environment of the moon to teach a basic principle in a way no one could ever forget. Just a beautiful moment.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of unique moments and environments, Al Worden, back in the command module, he had his own special first on the way home, didn't he?
He did indeed. The first deep space EVA.
But deep space, meaning not in Earth orbit, not in lunar orbit, but out in the void between worlds.
Exactly. After they left lunar orbit, well, on their way back to Earth, hundreds of thousands of miles from any planetary body, Al Worden went outside.
Why? What did he need to do out there?
He needed to retrieve the film cassettes from the big cameras in the sim bay, the panoramic camera, and the mapping camera. That film contained all the priceless orbital imagery.
Couldn't they get it from inside?
Nope. The sim bay was in the service module, which was jettisoned just before they re-entered Earth's atmosphere. If he didn't go out and get those cassettes, all that data would be lost.
So he had to perform a spacewalk in the middle of nowhere. What were the risks?
Well, all the usual risks of EVA, but amplified. Extreme temperatures, micrometeoroids, but the main thing was the sheer isolation. If anything went wrong, if his tether broke, he'd drift away forever. There was no rescue possible. Jim Irwin actually stood watch in the open hatch at the command module, but Worden had to carefully make his way along handrails on the outside of the service module to the sim bay, grab the canisters, and come back.
Just incredible. The image of him out there with the Earth and moon probably both visible as distant spheres.
It really underscores the capability they had developed, the ability for humans to operate effectively, even in that incredibly remote and hostile environment. Another core Apollo goal achieved right there. It took about 40 minutes. What a mission. Driving, geology, orbital mapping, physics demos, deep space EVAs. Okay, let's move towards wrapping up. Part 5, Legacy and Historical Context. How is Apollo 15 generally viewed today? It's widely considered by many space historians and scientists to be perhaps the most scientifically productive mission of the entire Apollo program, maybe tied with Apollo 17 later.
A gold standard.
Pretty much. It proved the J mission concept worked spectacularly well. The combination of the rover for mobility, the extended stay time, and the powerful orbital instruments in the sim bay that became the template for Apollo 16 and 17. The sheer volume of high-quality data and diverse samples returned was unprecedented.
And you can see that reflected in the documentation, right? The level of detail in the reports, the journals.
Oh, absolutely. The Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, the Flight Journal, the technical debriefings, the massive sample catalogs, the program summary report. It all points to an incredibly detailed, serious scientific undertaking. Apollo 15 set the bar really high.
A technological and scientific triumph. But, as with many complex human endeavors, especially those under intense public scrutiny, there was a complication to its legacy, wasn't there?
Yes, unfortunately. While the mission itself was near flawless from a technical standpoint, its aftermath was clouded by what became known as the postal cover scandal.
Right. For listeners who might not know, can you briefly explain what that was about?
Sure. Essentially, the three crew members, Scott, Irwin, and Warden, had arranged to carry several hundred unauthorized postal covers, basically stamped envelopes, with them on the mission to the moon.
Unauthorized.
Yeah.
Meaning NASA didn't approve.
Exactly. The plan, apparently, was for these covers, having flown to the moon, to be sold afterwards by an intermediary, with the proceeds going into trust funds for the astronauts' children.
Okay. Was that illegal?
Not technically illegal, no, but it was a clear violation of NASA regulations at the time. There were strict rules against astronauts using their position or their official flights for personal financial gain or commercial endorsements. It was seen as compromising the integrity of the program.
So what happened when this came out?
It emerged publicly in 1972, about a year after the flight, and caused quite a controversy. There was a lot of negative press. Public perception of the astronauts was extremely high, almost idealized, and this seemed like, well, profiteering to some.
What were the consequences for the crew?
NASA investigated, the astronauts cooperated. But in the end, all three received formal reprimands and were effectively grounded. They were removed from the flight rotation, meaning none of them flew in space again.
Wow. Despite executing one of the most successful missions in history.
Yes, it was a really unfortunate end to their active astronaut careers. It serves as a reminder, often included in detailed histories like Apollo by the Numbers, that these missions involved real people, complex situations, and intense pressures. The human drama is part of the story, too, not just the engineering and science. It highlights the high ethical standards expected in such a massive national effort. It's definitely an important part of the complete picture. Okay, so bringing it all together, Apollo 15, the mission where Apollo grew up, scientifically speaking. It shifted from the race to get there phase to the let's really explore this place phase, powered by that incredible lunar roving vehicle. It fundamentally changed what was possible on the moon,
From short walks to geological expeditions.
setting the stage for even more ambitious science on the final two landings.
We've covered the tech, the geology, the discoveries like Genesis Rock, the iconic moments. What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with about Apollo 15?
Well, think about this. We focus a lot on the 9 days or so the crew was actually in space and on the moon, but the real legacy, perhaps, is the sheer mountain of data, the samples, the records they generated, the stuff that came back.
Exactly. Apollo 15 established this incredible standard for documentation. The journals, the debriefings, the photos, the maps, the sample analyses. It's vast. And the discovery didn't stop when Endeavour splashed down.
It's still ongoing.
Absolutely. Because of that meticulous record-keeping, Apollo 15 is, in a very real sense, still an active research mission today. Scientists all over the world are still analyzing those samples, still studying those orbital photos, still poring over the transcripts and data Warden collected. The scientific preeminence that Apollo 15 established, it continues right now.
That's a fantastic point. The mission lives on through its data. Okay, let's wrap up with some hard numbers. Time for our By the Numbers segment for Apollo 15. All right. So Apollo 15 flew in July 1971. It was the fourth successful crewed lunar landing out of the 6 total.
And the first J mission.
First J mission, and crucially, the first mission to use the Lunar Roving Vehicle, the LRV.
How far did they drive that rover again?
Total distance driven across the 3 traverses was 17.5 miles, or just about 28 kilometers.
Incredible range.
Yeah.
How much time did Scott and Irwin spend outside on the surface?
Their total surface EVA time across the 3 moonwalks was 18 hours and 37 minutes.
Plus Worden's EVA.
Plus Worden's deep space EVA on the way home, which lasted 39 minutes, so over 19 hours of total spacewalking time for the mission.
And Scientific Haul, the lunar samples.
They brought back a hefty load, approximately 170 pounds, or about 77 kilograms, of lunar rocks and soil.
A massive increase over previous missions, setting the stage for Apollo 16 and especially 17, which brought back even more.
That's right. Apollo 15 really demonstrated the capability to return large, diverse, and scientifically valuable sample collections, providing the ground truth needed to understand the moon's history. All these achievements, are meticulously documented in resources like NASA's own Apollo by the Numbers.
A truly pivotal mission, from walking tentatively to driving boldly across the lunar landscape.